Paradise Killer is many things. A visual novel-inspired adventure game, an open-world collectathon, a detective mystery, a surreal vaporwave nightmare, and a dreamlike odyssey, all in one. But of all the things Paradise Killer is, there's one thing it isn't that seems to stand out the most. It's likely not like any other game you've ever experienced. When Clarke Smith and Phil Crabtree set out to make Paradise Killer, they had no idea what the final game would look like. It took years of experimentation, exploration, and iteration to breathe life into Paradise. But it also took a lot of trust between one another, not just as veteran game developers, but longtime friends. The two spent years of their life on an uncertain dream, laying it all on the line for an opportunity to make a game that was unique and personal, never knowing if it would pay off in the end. This is a look inside the development of Paradise Killer from the team that created it. Like many games, Paradise Killer started as something quite different. When longtime friends Clarke Smith and Phil Crabtree decided to finally make a game of their own after years in the game industry, they didn't exactly have a roadmap to follow.
Ollie and I both, we've been working in the game industry for quite some time, and we just kind of got to a point where we wanted to do something of our own. We talked about it for years. We had actually made a little mobile game in the past together, so we knew we could work together. And we were we kept kind of throwing ideas around and trying to start projects, but it never really got anywhere.
So like I say, we used to be in a band together, we've been friends since kids, so we knew we wanted to work together, and both of us worked in the games industry in different roles and in different places. So we decided to quit our jobs and start at Kaizen. And the first thing we started working on was a top-down shooting game, twin-stick shooter. And that is where a number of concepts for this game came from. Akiko, one of the characters in Paradise Killer, came, and her soldiers came from that. And kind of Lady Love Guy's the main character. Some of her character design was born from that as well, and some of the mythology was born from that.
And we had a couple of ideas. There's like a top-down shooter idea. There was a kind of crazy taxi-esque idea. And after some sort of discussion and trials, we decided on this idea of Paradise Killer, which at the time was more of a walking simulator. And that's not in a kind of a derogatory sense. I really like walking simulators. I really enjoyed things like Everyone's Gone to the Rapture. And so we wanted to try and see what we could do with that.
It was originally called Yamanote Mystery Killer, or Yamanote Killer Mystery, something like that. But it was a more of a walking simulator type game set around the Yamanote train line in Japan. That lasted probably about a week before we realised that we wanted to do something more fantastical, because we needed to have a world that was deserted, so that we weren't doing an open world with pedestrians and traffic and all of that. And we needed to have a world that we could control. Because we wanted you to investigate a mystery. And the problem we have setting mysteries in the real world when they're interactive is players are now very educated on police procedures. There's been a lot of very good TV shows about police work and a lot of good murder mystery films and all sorts. And so as soon as you put that in the real world, because we wanted to take the rails off player and let them investigate the mystery in any way they wanted, you suddenly have a lot of problems with people wanting to do like DNA tests or go and speak to this suspect or go and do stuff they know the police do. So we wanted to give ourselves a fantasy world where we control all of the rules and controlled what the player was able to do, but not what they were doing from second to second.
So yeah, we kicked around a few ideas. I've always been into kind of true crime, and around that time, like Serial had been out not too long before and Making a Murder, and it kind of just got some ideas ticking of what if you could make a murder mystery that was non-linear, so one where you truly got to choose who had committed the crime. So I kind of spoke to Ollie about it, and he's a wonderful designer, and he came up with a whole bunch of ideas. And so we started to kind of craft this story, and we used some characters that we had from previous game ideas that were never used, and this world of Paradise Killer started to come together.
Eventually, a cohesive plan came into being, an open-world investigation in an abandoned paradise, filled with things to collect, question, and piece together, inspired by other visual novel and detective games like Danganronpa and The Silver Case. In Paradise Killer, you take on the role of Lady Love Dies, a detective summoned from exile to solve a mass murder on an island that exists in a unique pocket dimension of gods, demons, and immortality. Investigation is freeform, with players able to roam freely between suspects, crime scenes, and more as they traverse the island. It creates a gameplay loop that rewards attentiveness on the part of the player, but also provides such a large space to explore that even the most eagle-eyed detectives could miss an important item if they aren't careful.
I've worked in interactive story stuff in games before, but it's all kind of like choose your own adventure. There's a linear path, and then you branch, do some stuff, come back, branch, do some stuff, come back. And the first story trip for our game, for Paradise Killer, was that, but then we realized that that wasn't going to work with the open world and the freedom that we wanted to give the player. So that is when we started bringing in more concepts of how you can speak to suspects, how the dialogue system works, how we let the player choose what to talk about, how we let the player investigate interiors with our kind of spy cam, very, very basic spy cam system. And early on, we thought that it would be okay just to let the player decide when they figured out the mystery, and that would be the end of it. But it became clear quite quickly that we needed a way for the player to feed back to the game, or to express themselves to the game about what they think the truth of the mystery is, and then that let the game feed back to the player and respond to that, and not tell the player whether they were right or not, but tell the player whether they had done a thorough investigation or not.
After a few iterations and countless ideas thrown about, the duo of developers that made up Kaizen Gameworks had a strong direction for Paradise Killer's gameplay. But they still wanted to create an interesting and unique world for players to interact with. For that, they would look to a variety of influences, from the gonzo style of Suda51 to the games from their youth, eldritch horror, and even, perhaps unsurprisingly, political events like Brexit.
Ollie put his own real flavour into it. So much of the story and the art style all came from Ollie. So he was kind of putting all these things together in the background whilst I was working on the technical systems.
I did a pitch, like a one-sheet story pitch, which was just flavour. The murder mystery of the game wasn't in at that point. It was the flavour. The first character I wrote, the name of was Witness to the End, and at that point we didn't have a main character name, and it was just like a document of flavour, kind of dialogue styles, and talking a bit about the pantheon of the gods that rule the game world.
It was probably a few months before we had something that was semi-representative, but even then it was pretty different to what you see now. We still had the idea of you were on an island and you were talking to people, but it took a very different structure.
And then when we started digging into what the aesthetic would be, 2018, when we were working on this, we in the UK had gone through Brexit, so our country was awful, and then a lot of countries around the world were awful, and everywhere seemed to be getting more awful. So we wanted to make something otherworldly that the player could escape to and have a break from reality with. For
the actual style itself as it developed now, it's something Ollie believed in more than I did. And the great thing about working with someone like Ollie, who's A, a great designer, and B, been friends with for so long, is that there's just this trust. So he's come up with these ideas and it's like, well, I'll trust you to put them together. And some of the early versions were, ropey, because you've got to throw together a tree or a walkway in a couple of minutes, and they're just these grey areas, and it doesn't look great. But the more and more he did, the more and more it just started to feel Right.
And one of my main inspirations at the time was a lot of Suda's work, a lot of what Grasshopper do, because their games are very otherworldly and take you away. Something like Santa Destroy in No More Heroes is a very mundanely otherworldly place in a lot of ways. And then stuff like the 25 Wards in Silver Case games is very otherworldly. And I'm also a very big fan of the cosmic horror of Lovecraft's work. And I do want to say that I do not agree with any of his views, because when I was reading it as a young teenager, I'm, a white dude who didn't have much of a view on the world about how other groups are talked about, and coming to it as an adult, you realise that Lovecraft is a racist piece of shit. He's also a classist piece of shit. But his pantheon of gods really stuck with me, and so we wanted to do something with a kind of cosmic horror, but not in the same way that a lot of works influenced by Lovecraft do cosmic horror. We wanted this contrast of very nice high fashion people looking like they're in a tropical resort, but then you take one step over onto the other side of the street and there's a bloodbath where they have slaughtered a lower class of citizen to praise and worship their goat-headed gods. And we didn't want to focus too much on the horror of the cosmic horror of the gods, but it was abstract and absurd and stupid. The concept of stupid gods was really important to me, because seeing people worship these idiotic gods that are callous and uncaring, and it was really important to show the stupidity of it all. And these people, the syndicate that have built this otherworldly island to hide away and to worship these gods, it's such a futile exercise and such a pointless thing to do.
Like the game design, the world and aesthetic of Paradise Killer is an assemblage of various influences and ideas that, on their surface, might not make for the most compelling blend. So it came down to the team's iterative process to take those ideas and make them into a cohesive whole. But being a team comprised mostly of 2 people, that process meant a lot of iteration, and more than a few creative workarounds.
The more he did, the more I sort of trusted it, and the more we both leapt into it. It kept developing towards this vaporwave look. And I don't know if that was necessarily conscious. I think at some point, for me at least, I thought, well, it is going that way. Ollie's been talking about it going more vaporwave. We should lean into it. Yeah, it gave it its own style. When you're an indie game company with making your first game, you've got to give it a style that people will pay attention to. And this was naturally going towards that. And we had tons of saturation. We had to turn it down in the end, but we had all these saturation with all these bright pinks and all these really strong colours. And it just felt different. And that kind of just kept things moving along.
And then from there, a lot of the aesthetic choices were a lot of art constraints. So it was just us 2 full-time on the project, so we couldn't do high-end photorealistic art. That wasn't an interest. So it was for us, let's make something that kind of looked like a high-end Dreamcast. It looks way more than that. But it was mostly me doing all of the environment. 99% of the environment asset making was me. So it's just what the hell could we do in the time?
So when we first started the game, we kind of said, well, what style do we want? And I think it's sort of a subconscious almost conversation you have with yourself when you're making a game. And Ollie and I have known each other for years and years and years, and we've got great memories of playing games back on the PS1, PS2, on Dreamcast, and we've both got a real kind of respect for the Dreamcast as a system. And we thought, if we could achieve that's a look we really like, how can we make it? But we didn't necessarily want to make it as a Dreamcast game. We wanted to say, well, what would a Dreamcast game look like now if you could have high resolution textures? And we combined that with the fact that none of us could model. Ollie hadn't done any game art before this. So what could we do? We can get some assets and we can make some things, but we've got to keep it quite simple.
A lot of the textures I made were kind of these PS1 pixely art style textures, and then we used some assets from the Unreal Marketplace, and I didn't have time to go in and fix those. to put them into my texture style, but it kind of all hangs together. So it kind of works. So you kind of get this feeling where something's not quite right. Too much of the world looks a little bit off, and I think we kind of got away with it. None of it was planned. A lot of it was accidental. A lot of it was just pure constraints on time and ability.
And we kind of looked at ideas like brutalism, which is these quite solid, simple shapes. We both quite liked that. So we had some areas, and early on in the game, we had some areas that were extremely brutalist. The council area was very big and blocky, and it was massive at one point. And it looked really cool. And so we just sort of kept moving towards that.
Like, this game is so many, like, things that each of us wanted to do mashed together and being made to work. I really wanted to have to go exploring around kind of the apartment blocks and suburban areas, because me and Rachel often go to Japan, and often go to Japan with Bill and his wife, and we just go off exploring in different parts of towns and stuff. So we wanted that. We knew we wanted kind of apartment blocks, Japanese-style apartment blocks and suburbs. We knew that we had to do something with the syndicate area to make that very different. And I'm a big fan of brutalist architecture, so we made that these kind of huge concrete structures. And that was because it would be a contrast to the suburbs. But then it showed, like, a lot of government buildings in the real world are brutalist. And again, with Lovecraft stuff, he writes about like monolithic structures rising out of the sea, or planets covered with unspeakably vast, monolithic cities. And so that was part of that as well. We make these huge buildings that are concrete, but slightly alien and monolithic looking. And then the religious areas were based around these statues. We started using statues, but we had no idea what we were going to make them look like. I knew we didn't want to just have kind of normal marble statues. And then Rachel did our crystal shader for us, which really defined, like, that was a real turning point with how we define what the religious areas look like. And then mixing all of that with the tropical beach vibe, it was something otherworldly and somewhere where people could go on holiday, like that desire to do that, and then just smashing it together.
And about, I don't know, maybe a year or so into development, maybe a little less, we looked at our UI, and at the time our UI was very functional. It was grey boxes, it was pretty boring, there was nothing special going on there. And we're thinking, what can we do with it, what can we do with it? And Ollie just came to me one day and said he's had an idea. What if it were like city pop covers, city pop album covers? And he presented me a sheet of reference city pop. And I thought, well, let's try it. And it turned out city pop's covers are quite easy to make because they're quite strong, singular colours. Just a bit of white and blue, quite bold text, nice simple layouts. And it allowed us to really lean into it. And for the UI, we always thought that UI should be part of the game, should be part of the experience. So we thought just lean into it, like make it extreme. And the more you can kind of push in that direction, and the more you can encompass the idea that this is city pop, the more it kind of fits together. And then the same goes with the vaporwave. So rather than trying to say, well, it's a bit vaporwave, we go, well, it's all vaporwave. And then we get the synthwave stuff in, and just really lean into it.
One way that players were encouraged to explore the island of Paradise Killer was through collectibles, including collectibles like blood crystals, a form of currency scattered all around the island.
I believe you can play in a way where you'd run out of blood crystals, because if you fast travelled everywhere and bought everything, you would run out. Like, there's not an endless supply. But generally speaking, in playtesting, we just try to understand how many do you need for it to feel quite rare and special at the start, because you don't want the player to feel like, oh, I could just do what I want. There's got to be this sort of rarity of blood crystals initially. So there's a lot of them that are kind of out in the world and fairly discoverable. Like, as soon as you come out to the judges area, there's one on the wall next to you, and then in that area you go down to, there's another couple that are easily discovered. So we kind of got the minimum number in, and then Ollie did a pass of just putting them out in the world to the more explorable areas, so up in the hills or down around the back or something. And they were kind of sprinkled there to give you a purpose to go and explore. So it wasn't like we knew you needed 60 blood crystals, so we'll put 70. It was more, we've got the number we need on the island now. But if a player were to spend their time going to this location, how could we reward them for that? And so you reward them with a blood crystal.
Until now, the development of Paradise Killer has been a journey of unexpected changes, inspirations, and limitations. But before launch, the team at Kaizen Gameworks would have a few more challenges to deal with, mostly stemming from the game's expansive dialogue system. In Paradise Killer, as you collect clues and case files, your options to question characters and cross-examine them grow exponentially. Making this system was no small task. It took a lot of playtesting and a series of tools working in the background for the game to keep track of the myriad options players could use.
We didn't have a game plan going in for this. I've been a narrative designer on kind of branching dialogues before, but it's all linear. You go down a path and then you make a choice, and the directive on that choice of this company was that these should be significant. And a meaningful bit of action takes place. A meaningful event happens on either end of the branch, and then they come back. Or they may go wider and wider again, but it will all come back. There is still a somewhat linear path through it. Compared to Paradise Killer, that is relatively easy to plan out because you know certain things happen at certain points, whereas with Paradise Killer, we didn't.
The game needed to change in certain ways. So there's certain ways that you'd go and have a conversation, and it was very easy to expose the systems behind the game. It didn't feel very natural, but we tried to make it natural, but it didn't really get that way. And so Ollie took a look at it, and again he started to layer on these ideas of how we can make it a bit more gamified. And that involved things like choosing which case file you wanted to talk to. Previously, we tried to auto-detect what you might want to talk about and feed you information. And it worked on a small scale, but as the game started getting more complex, it just got bizarre to track and really hard for the player to understand. So we started to make all these changes. And around that time, we really established the rules of the world as well. And our idea of choice and consequence was right there at all times. The idea the game would never lie to you became extremely important, and we always had to build this element of trust into the game.
The dialogue system is very flexible. The actual tool we have is very flexible and very extensible, so we can just add in a lot of stuff. And what we do is there's a lot of checking of, does the player know this? So we have these knowledge items behind the scenes which are given to you depending on things that are asked in dialogue, things that you've done in the world, things that you've picked up. So we're constantly checking against your inventory and other variables, these knowledge things that we set, so that we know if you've asked Dr. Doomjazz about this one particular piece of evidence, like the photo of Akiko in his yacht, and then you go and speak to Akiko, we've set a flag there that can be checked against. So that is kind of like the low level of how we do it.
So as we were kind of adding more to the story and adding more systems to the world, just kept coming back down to, well, if the player does something, we've got to respect it. And if the player changes something, we've got to respect that too. So just trying to build it all up, and then trying to understand how we can make the game work no matter what order the player attacks it. So it doesn't matter who you speak to or what you find. We had to make these systems so that if you spoke to a character before finding an item, the dialogue might read one way, but if you picked up an item later, it might read another way. So just trying to make it feel natural and supportive of what the player wants to do.
Let's talk about examples. So you go and speak to Yuri about a piece of evidence. And so what we would do is we would write that as dialogue, and it would be like 10 nodes long. Player says something, Yuri says something, player says something, Yuri says something. And then that would go in game, and we could play that and test it and give it, yep, that's fine. And then later on, we would put in because we did no upfront planning on what the story would be, it just kind of grew and evolved. It was me keeping a lot of stuff in my head about, okay, we've got this one bit of dialogue for Yuri about this piece of evidence, but the nature of this evidence has had to change slightly, and now another character is involved and has something to say about it, which will inform your opinion, the player's opinion, Lady Lovedice's opinion on the evidence. So now we need to go back and retrofit that back into the Yuri dialogue. And a lot of the characters, it helped that a lot of the characters, I struggled to find their voice, their writing style, their dialogue style until quite near the end. So their conversations were quite basic for a lot of the development of the game. So it meant it was easy for me to just go and shoehorn in another node and check to see, okay, you spoke to Yuri about this evidence. Now Lydia has told you something about this evidence as well. So next time you go back to Yuri, this conversation strand needs to be active again, and it needs to have this branch in it so you can revisit it. So it was a lot of like just keeping stuff in my head and reacting to stuff and playing it constantly. We're playing the game so much, and it would just be like this little bit, something you'd notice something. I don't recommend making a game like this because it's very prone to human error.
There were probably a lot of issues with systems breaking quite late on. In a game like Paradise Killer, it's incredibly hard to test because, you know, at the start of the game, you can attack things in a certain order, but the more you play, obviously the number of variables as to what you could have done in what order expands out. So we tried to have a whole bunch of systems to test things, to understand exactly where things could break through. They call it automation, so we can try and run tests to understand what happens, try and automate some gameplay, but it was never perfect.
And there's no way you could do this with a bigger team because it requires one person to have all of this in their head and have the ability to very quickly move between, like we have something like 550 dialogue files, move and hop between files, knowing where each of these things live and then putting in the correct branches for it and tying it back up. It was one of the reasons we didn't do voice acting, is because we tore apart the trials when we did something stupid and we were only ever testing the game. When we would test the game and do full playthroughs, we were doing full playthroughs, which meant that we got all the evidence and we went down all the available dialogue trees before going to trial. And then so you'd go into the trial and it would all hang together. It would all work really well because you've done everything in the game. And then I had to do a speed run, kind of a partial playthrough, about 2 or 3 weeks before final. And realised that if you only have partial evidence, the trials just fall apart completely because none of the logic was like, there were so many branches, there were so many bits of things, different variations of dialogue, different evidence that could be presented in different orders, and a partial playthrough, just the game fell apart at the end.
For an independent development team, a setback like this could be fatal for a released product. You only get one chance at a first release, and if the core of your game is broken, all the work on the world, characters, gameplay, and story will have been for nothing. Under such circumstances, many teams might break down or even worse, turn on each other. But the duo at Kaizen Gameworks had something that can be rare to find in game development, especially in times of crisis. They trusted each other.
Yeah, so when we discovered the problem with the trials, it was a big oh shit moment of like, this is a tremendous amount of work. Because the original vision for the trials, the original implementation for the trials, because I was worried about deadlines, was that the player wouldn't have the ability to choose which evidence to present. They would, the way the trials are structured is that there is a number of case files in the game. The judge character takes you through them in an order that we determine that makes narrative sense. And then you choose a suspect for each case file. And then Lady Lovedice would present all the evidence you found for that character, that suspect, for that case file.
It felt pretty good most of the time, but there were some cases when you could go into it and the game would play and let you get through but it was really unsatisfying. It would kind of ignore evidence you picked up, or I think in some cases it let you accuse people who really shouldn't be able to accuse based on that evidence. And yeah, that was a real panic when you get a bug like that quite late on.
And in a game about player agency, we had let ourselves be constrained by worry about deadline too much. So I tore them all apart and redid them to put player choice in. There was a bunch of dialogue branches ready, and I just had to put in the player choice, but it required a huge amount of rework. So when we found this problem with the trials, that they fell apart if you didn't have all the evidence, I was like, well, shit, that is a massive problem. But I've pulled these things apart again before, and I'll do it again.
We knew this game was going to be hard to make, so we made everything very systemic. So we could fix it, and it's not like we could tick a box and fix it. We had to go through and fix it, but it's quite easy to make safe fixes. So once you understand the problem, you can identify them, go through, fix all those things up.
And thankfully, our tool set and the fidelity of our game makes a week, 2 weeks before ship, I can do this within a week if I need to, and I do need to. And we encountered a lot of problems that we didn't know how to solve on this game, as you do with any game.
All the way through, there was these bizarre bugs, as with any game. And when there's just two of you making it, it's like, well, how do we finish making the game and fix all these problems?
Me and Phil worked very well together, and any time a problem came up, we solved it with just a bit of focus. A lot of effort and energy and hard work. But really, when both of us put our heads together, we managed to solve some fairly complex problems. So when we found this problem, I was like, we have a huge problem. We need to tear apart these trials, but we're 2 weeks away. Just so you know, I need you on standby to provide any tech support on this. And Phil was fine with it. It's like, yeah, tell me what you need, we will get it done.
But you just have to, you have to go through it, prioritize, find a way to make it work. And whilst it wasn't completely bug-free on release, I'm very happy that we had to do minimum updates because there was nothing game-breaking. I don't think there's anything story-breaking, which is a real testament to Ollie's skill of development and the way he wrote that story. He did an incredible job of it. And I sort of sat in the background and just tried to make sure all the systems hung together and didn't crash too often or didn't produce too many unexpected results.
When it came time to fix these trials, I knew the systems were kind of in a state where it was more of a data problem than it was a systems problem, and I could pull it apart and put it back together knowing that the system would be able to take the strain. It just needed to be rewired. So whilst it was fairly heart-stopping to discover just how broken it was, I knew that it was doable. But then you kind of run into the issue of like, okay, well, if this unexpected week of work suddenly takes a week of work before ship, what else slips? Like, what do we have to push out to be able to bring up to get these trials up to spec? Because if these trials don't work, then the game is for nothing.
A lot of it is down to how Ollie wrote the dialogue and split it up, and sort of was able to keep things quite modular in some ways. Like, we always thought that if we keep things modular, we can swap and change and try and keep things quite understandable, not just for the player, but for also when we're making it. The other big thing is just iteration. Like, we both approach this, we're going to have to do a lot of iteration. So we knew things would have to change. Both were really flexible on it. So we made systems that meant that we could quite easily reassign, change, update, alter, do whatever we needed to do. And just keep testing it and just go through it and understand that, right, once this works, that's good. We will try our hardest not to change anything in the system that would alter that behavior.
But thankfully, because the game is so low budget and so low-fi, that it's a lot of me writing and checking against different variables and forcing everyone to stop what they're doing and be like, okay, go and collect, play the game for 2 hours. and collect a bunch of evidence and speak to a bunch of people, then go to trial, and does it hold up? And if it does, great. If it doesn't, okay, what fell apart, and I'll fix that, and then let's do it again. And so there were 3 of us just collecting different evidence, play for 2 hours, go to trial, play for 2 hours, go in a different direction, and then go to trial. And thankfully, it all worked.
Even with difficulties related to the dialogue system fixed close to launch, the game wasn't without its share of bugs.
One of my favourite ones early on was when you tried to get on a ladder. Sometimes you'd get on a ladder, and sometimes it would lock you in a continual forward movement. So you would just keep going. I think again around the ladders, sometimes you would climb up to the top and then it would just rocket you forwards. We had a bunch of problems where you teleport around the world a fair bit in Paradise Killer. So either when you fast travel or when you go to certain areas, you can kind of teleport you to them. And about like 10% of the time, you just fall through the floor. And no reason why. The physics was there. Everything was set up right. It was reporting correctly. But for whatever reason, you were through the floor. And, there's a proper fix to that, which is to go and properly investigate what's happening in the engine and do a whole load of fixes there. But again, when you're 2 people, you kind of have to brute force it sometimes. So I think in some cases we just made sure there were kind of these thick planes under the world, or maybe you spawn just a little bit above the world, and by the time the fade out has happened, you're now sat where you should be.
There's always was one problem thing, and no matter how many times you go at it, it never quite. There's always some underlying problem somewhere, and unfortunately we did ship with a branch where a character that you can discover partway through the game was available in the trials, even though you haven't met them, and they were referenced, even though no character should know about them under certain conditions. And we just squashed that bug with the updates. But like I say, no game should be made like this. It's not a good way to make a game, because these bugs can creep in. It becomes such a large amount of user error. There's
still a bug in the game where you can jump in a certain way and you can fly up forever, and we've never quite figured out how to properly reproduce that one and fix it. So there's little bits like that. Some people have found bugs where you can skip across the water, which I quite like. I'm kind of happy someone found that, so we're probably never going to fix that. It's really cool to see people finding new ways of playing the game. So stuff like that is wonderful.
Thankfully, we got, I don't want to say lucky because it was a lot of work, but we managed to come out of it without too many logic bugs around that, thankfully. And I think it helps that because the game is weird in terms of its fiction, players will forgive the odd C-class logic bug or something. They won't notice it. Some players might notice it, some players, hopefully no player ever encounters it, but then some players won't notice it, or they will paper over in their mind the crack that they've seen, because there's so much world building and fiction that they kind of explain it away themselves. And I have seen that actually on, I think it's Steam or Twitter or something, where people were explaining away a kind of narrative discrepancy that they'd found, which was good because it means they weren't complaining about a bug. They managed to, they were having a great time even though they'd encountered this thing.
With the game all but completed, Phil and Ollie only had one final challenge: to wait patiently for reception from players and critics. They had spent years of their lives on this uncertain gamble, pouring heart and soul into a project when they had no idea if it would succeed or fail. And after each problem that had been solved, each creative solution that had been found, it all came down to this. Would the effort have been worth it? Would anyone want to play this weird, strange creation? In a market dominated by fast-paced action games and online multiplayer, would such a comparatively restrained, slow, and obtuse experience have any appeal? It's the struggle of every creative, not just game developers. To spend hours, days, weeks, even years on a project, never knowing if it will be worth it in the end. Which is a question in and of itself. What does it mean to succeed? Is it just a question of sales or critical reception? What if the game gets great reviews but sells poorly? Would it be enough in the end to be happy with a game you created from the ground up with a friend, even if nobody played it? Questions like these were on the minds of two close friends who had spent years of their lives making a game when it was finally released to the world.
We were expecting no one to review it because we're an unknown game. We hadn't had an awful lot of interest preview-wise because we struggled with selling the game what it is, because you look at one screen and it's this kind of empty open world, and you look at another screen and it looks like a visual novel, and people kept saying it's a visual novel. Like, no, it's not. It uses that language to deliver dialogue, but it is like a open world exploration thing. So we assumed that people weren't going to review it, and we assumed that it would sell almost nothing.
We didn't really expect it to do that well. We put it out for a demo. We knew some people liked it, and we'd taken it to a show and we knew some people liked it, but we weren't expecting a lot because, we kind of lost sight of what a weird game it was. And because we were making it for ourselves, we took a lot of risks that you wouldn't normally do if you worked as part of a big studio. So we decided, we had to pick our battles. So things like 2D characters are, in their own way, a risk. We did a lot of dialogue choices, a lot of gameplay choices that are a risk. You can play the whole game without finding features like the double jump because we never tell you about them, which again is a risk.
Because we were doing 2D characters and we didn't have to worry about rigging and animations and stuff like that, it meant that we could do stuff that we couldn't normally do. Like Lady Love Dies as a plus-size woman, and that is very important for us. And I think that it helped reviewers that were looking for, to not play another shaven-headed, angry, middle-aged white dude. That there was something for them there.
We were always really nervous leading up to launch because we thought, are people going to understand the game? Are they going to get it?
Because it is lo-fi in a lot of ways. It is rough around the edges. It has, some jank, decent amount of jank, and but I really love Deadly Premonition. So I love a bit of jank. Who cares if it's rough as long as it's got soul? But obviously that you can't count on that with reviewers. So we knew when the embargo was up, and we had no idea who was going to review it. And then we were sat there counting down to the embargo time, and then GameSpot was the first one to go up, and that was a 9 out of 10. And I almost fell out of my chair. I couldn't believe it, because this is a weird, dumb game for psychos, and one of the most mainstream places has given it a 9 out of 10.
It's one of those things that I'm really happy to say that we made a game that we wanted to make, and it wasn't easy because we didn't have much money. There was a lot of personal stuff going on at the same time, but the game's so important to both of us. It's really nice to have it out there and to have people enjoy it. I still get messages from people saying, I just played the game and they really enjoyed it, and it's crazy to me that people spend the time to tell me that. That's to enjoy it enough to tell me. It's really fantastic.
And when you're doing an indie game like this, and you set fire to all of your savings, sacrificed a bunch of time with friends and family, and this can make or break your future. What we didn't want to do, we wanted to put out a game that we were proud of and that we wanted to make, and that was this is our one shot, so let's make it count. But we really wanted to also continue the studio and make this our living rather than going back to normal studio work. And so when that 9 out of 10 hit, it was like, whoa, we didn't expect that. We didn't expect anyone to think this game was that good. But also now we potentially have a future. If more reviews come in like this, then there is potentially a future for the studio. And so it was like these two bits of unbelievable things. People like this game, and people like this game, and we could potentially build a future for the studio.
I'm a very introverted person myself, and I think one of the problems with making a game that's so personal to you is that it feels weird to put it out there into the world. And I put it out there, and I think in my head, I always had this idea that if you put out something that people really enjoy and you get some recognition for it, it's going to be great. You're going to get all this, not necessarily recognition, but you're going to feel really good about what you've done, and you're going to feel like you've achieved something. And I do feel like that, but the imposter syndrome is still very much there. The fact that people are playing a game that is so personal to me still feels a little bit uncomfortable in some ways. And that's not saying I'm not happy to play it, because I'm absolutely delighted. I'm so happy people are enjoying it. But I'm not quite sure how to process that, because I've only made games as part of a bigger team. I've been a small cog in a big wheel, big machine. And here, so much of myself is in that game that it's very strange. And the development itself, to me, was very difficult. Not to bring the tone down, but right at the start of it, I lost my stepdad to cancer, which was really, really painful. And the fallout from that with the family was very, very difficult as well. And so an awful lot of the game, for me, was not just me trying to make a career or trying to make a piece of art or a game to put out there. It was my coping mechanism. It was, I had something to focus on, and if I could focus on the game and build it, that's what kept me going every day. And I think at the point we released, it felt like that was a good decision. It felt like I'd said, well, this is what I needed. It's gone well, and all this time and energy I put into making the game has helped me heal. So that has really been there. And this is the first time I've actually really spoken about it, because I'm quite, as I say, quite introvert. But having that out there was wonderful.
So, and then when we started seeing more reviews, we wondered if GameSpot was an isolated case, and then some more rolled in, and it was wild. It was just unbelievable that there were consistently good scores. Several 9 out of 10s, a load of 8 out of 10s, recommended on Eurogamer, and we couldn't believe that people were resonating. It was resonating with people because a lot of what was in it was fairly non-standard, but I think that is what helped people get into it.
I think we never really had this big conversation about what it's done or what it's meant for us, and I think it's because we know each other so well. It's kind of understand and can appreciate what it means to each other. But for me, at least, that is still absolute wonder that I am here making games still. We didn't think that would happen. We really thought we'd release Paradise Killer, we would have to then freshen up our CVs and go and apply for jobs, because it is expensive to make a game. It's expensive to keep paying wages, unless you can your game sells well or you get other game deals lined up. But yeah, it's just been a very emotional ride, not only because it was our first game, but because of the personal stuff that we're going through, and having it out there in the world. It just means, it both means the world to me, that it's out there and people enjoy it, but it's also terrifying, because now that piece of me, which I traditionally kept quite to myself, is out there. And I think it's going to take me quite a long time to get used to the idea. And I think every time we release a game after this, I'm still going to have that cycle of feeling a little bit uncomfortable about putting some of myself out there. But I think it's really important for me to do that as well. I'm so happy I did it. It's a thing that I wouldn't have achieved without Ollie, and kind of without his help and his assistance across the board.
There's so many little and big problems that Phil and I just butted our heads together and solved. And it feels really good when you are working with someone and you can trust the way they work. And so I would say to Phil, like, here's a feature that we want to do. Here is what I want it to feel like and the player experience to be. And then he would just, rather than having to spell it out and break it down in like flowcharts and design documents, I could trust him to go off and do it and present his own spin on it. And oftentimes it would be something he would put in a quirk or a feature or an addition that we hadn't thought of, but he just had the idea to do, and it just improved the game so much. Because when you're trying to make quite an ambitious game with just two people, there's only so much brain processing power you've got, and having him come back and be like, "Yep, I figured this out, and I've done this other thing that I think improves it or gives it a different flavor," and it's like, "Yep, fantastic, brilliant. Now I just need to put some data in, some art data or some writing, whatever that might be, and this works." And the game had a lot of those little moments which are more difficult to achieve when I've been working on larger games with larger teams, because they have to be de-risked so much because so much money is being put into it, or the game just it's struggled to find out what it is and what makes it special, and it just limped over the finish line. But it felt like with this game, every few days there was something new and exciting going in, just by asking people to do something, and rather than dictating what that thing should be, it was just, can you solve this problem? And just something special would come back.
Making a game, there's a lot of kind of stress, a lot of effort, but there's also all these really nice moments of joy, especially when you're working with someone like Ollie, who you just trust, and he goes, "Hey, here's a thing I've done," and bang, there it is, this really cool visual or system or piece of dialogue or something like that. We wouldn't tell each other everything that went into the game, and I'd be walking around and I'd go to find a Shinji, and suddenly there'd be lyrics from a song that I really like, or one of the vending machines sells a hot chocolate, which refers to a time when we were in Japan together and I was searching for a hot chocolate near the top of a mountain, and now there's this elusive hot chocolate which you can find at the top of a mountain. And all those little things he does, that's kind of little in jokes, but also very good to fit the world. They always make me smile.
And then after release, it's been weird. We've made so many new friends from this game, so there's a lot of happy memories there, and then there's been a lot of weird stuff, like suddenly a physical edition is being sent out to people, and suddenly t-shirts are being made and vinyls are being pressed, and that is just so wild, and there's so many happy memories tied up with that kind of stuff. And it's just weird and hard to believe, and it still seems strange, but until someone tells me this has all been a big lie, I'll carry on working.
Paradise Killer is many things. It's the story of an exiled investigator solving an otherworldly and surreal mystery. It's the story of strange, broken people navigating a strange, broken world. But more than that, it's the story of two trusting friends who bet everything they had on making a game. In some ways, it's not just like any other game. It has strange and unusual artistic choices, its gameplay is freeform and friendly to player choice, and its story is bizarre and esoteric. But in other ways, it's like many other games of its kind. A labor of love carefully crafted by a team who had no idea how people would react to it. Whatever comes next for the team at Kaizen Gameworks, I'm sure fans have much to look forward to. But even if they never release another game, Paradise Killer can stand proudly on its own as a testament to the power of creativity and originality, even in the face of doubts and fears. There's no shortage of similar game development stories in the indie world that have had far less happy endings. The game industry has broken many great creatives, and there aren't any easy solutions to fix it. There's no guarantee at the end of a game's development if it will review well, sell well, or even be worth the care put into crafting it. Paradise Killer is a great game, but it also got lucky, landing reviews at major publications that gave it the press exposure it needed to become a sales success. Who can say how many other games might have shared the same level of success if given a review on IGN or GameSpot instead of being overlooked? I hope games like Paradise Killer inspire not just developers, but critics and players to take more chances with the games they play, to explore the niches they've never heard about, and investigate the strange, quirky titles they might not otherwise be interested in. Maybe the next unheard of game you buy will become a favorite, or at the very least, will help a hardworking developer afford to keep pursuing their creative dream. You won't know if you don't try. Which brings us to the end of our story. If there's a message to the tale of Paradise Killer's development that I've taken from speaking with Ollie and Phil, it's It's that even with hard work, innovation, and a unique vision, success is never guaranteed. But you'll also never know how much your work can mean to the world if you don't take the chance to make something special. The best way to find out is to go and solve that mystery for yourself. Hello everyone, and thank you for watching. I want to send a special shout out and thank you especially to Ollie Clarke-Smith and Phil Crabtree of Kaizen Gameworks, who trusted me with this story and who sat down for interviews and graciously answered my questions and supplied me with plenty of extra details such as screenshots and pre-release game footage. Without their help, this very much wouldn't have been possible. I also want to thank my patron subscribers for their patience as I've put together this and start to put together the next documentary. I've had a rough time lately between work and this gig, and it's been hard running this channel and not getting the views that I wish I would have or think I should have by this point in the channel's experience. So any help you can get in sharing this video and getting it out there, liking, subscribing, and watching all the other videos is very much appreciated. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.